The hum of Regina's luxury sedan was the only sound accompanying her as she drove home late that evening. The suburban streets of Belmont Hills were calm, the kind of calm that could deceive you into believing the world was at peace. Regina Holt, a respected judge with over 2 decades on the bench, was mentally replaying the day's court proceedings as she often did during her nightly drives. She had spent the day deliberating on a high-profile case, her mind focused, her judgment sharp. But tonight, weariness tugged at her shoulders. She thought about her son's upcoming graduation, the speech she still needed to prepare, and the promise she'd made to herself to take a break once this case wrapped up. Life was hectic, but good, until blue and red lights flickered in her rearview mirror. Her brows furrowed as she slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. She wasn't speeding, hadn't skipped a signal. She reached for her purse, where her driver's license and registration were neatly stored. The reflection of the patrol car's lights danced on her dashboard as 2 officers approached from behind. One tapped on the driver's side window with a force that felt unnecessarily aggressive. "Evening, ma'am. License and registration." The taller officer barked, his tone devoid of courtesy. Regina handed over her documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer's partner leaned in, his flashlight sweeping across the car's interior. "We ask the questions," he muttered. Regina's professional instincts told her to remain calm, to not escalate what already felt like a hostile interaction. "Of course, officers," she replied, her tone measured. But the next few moments unfolded like a scene from a bad television drama. Questions turned into accusations. Accusations into thinly veiled threats. Regina attempted to explain her career, her purpose for being on the road at this hour. But the officers didn't care. To them, she was just another driver to intimidate, another person to assert their authority over. Something felt wrong, but Regina couldn't place her finger on it. Still, she stayed composed, knowing this was only the beginning. The taller officer, whose name tag read Bradley, stepped back, flipping through Regina's documents with a deliberate slowness that felt more like a performance than procedure. His partner, a stocky man with a shaved head named Officer Kent, stayed close, his flashlight now trained directly on Regina's face. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here so late?" Kent asked, his tone teetering on condescension. Regina inhaled deeply, choosing her words carefully. "I'm heading home. I had a late night at work." Bradley smirked, glancing up from her license. "Late night? Huh. What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a judge," she said, meeting his gaze. Her tone wasn't boastful. It was matter of fact. But instead of respect, her words were met with skepticism. "A judge?" Kent chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a new one." Regina felt her stomach tighten. She'd seen this play out before, not with her, but with others. The dismissiveness, the disbelief, it was all too familiar. She kept her expression neutral, though her heart was beginning to race. Bradley leaned closer, his smirk growing wider. "You got any proof of that, Judge? Or should we skip the formalities and get to the part where you tell us what you're really up to?" "Proof?" Regina repeated, her voice calm but firm. "Officers, I've complied with everything you've asked. I've handed you my license and registration. If there's an issue, I'd like to address it." Bradley didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her documents to Kent and motioned toward the back of the car. "Step out of the vehicle for a moment." Regina considered refusing. She knew her rights, knew they had no valid reason to escalate the situation further, but she also knew the risk of standing her ground. With a composed sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. Kent moved closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Turn around," he ordered. "Excuse me?" Regina asked, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "Are you detaining me?" Regina asked, the weight of the moment sinking in. "On what grounds?" Bradley shrugged, his smirk now a full-blown grin. "Suspicious behavior. We'll sort it out at the station." Regina's heart pounded in her chest as she felt cold metal clamp around her wrists. The humiliation was visceral, raw. She wanted to protest, to remind them of who she was. But something stopped her. They didn't care. They weren't interested in the truth, only in the narrative they had already constructed. As she was guided toward the back of the patrol car, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors peeked through windows, a few stepping onto their porches to watch. Regina caught the eye of an older woman in a robe and slippers, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. Regina didn't dare speak, didn't dare look away. She simply allowed herself to be placed in the back seat, her head held high despite the ache of humiliation creeping in. The drive to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Regina stared out the window, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She thought of her son, her colleagues, the countless people who looked up to her as a beacon of justice. How would they react to this? What would this mean for her career, her reputation? But even amidst the flood of emotions, one thought stood out. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. The holding cell was small and cold, the kind of space that seemed to leach warmth from the soul. Regina sat on the bench, her hands still cuffed, her wrists beginning to ache from the tight metal. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to let the officers see her discomfort. They had taken her belongings, phone, purse, even her watch, and left her in silence, as if hoping to break her resolve. Minutes felt like hours. Regina's mind raced with questions, fears, and a growing sense of determination. She knew she wasn't the first black woman to be treated this way, but she was determined to ensure she'd be one of the last. She mentally cataloged every interaction, every word spoken, and every action taken since the moment she was pulled over. These details would matter later, of that. She was certain. Through the bars, she could see the officers laughing, their voices carrying into the dimly lit corridor. She really thinks she's someone important, Kent joked, his voice loud and mocking. Bradley joined in with a comment Regina couldn't make out, but the laughter that followed made it clear it wasn't flattering. She closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of patience and strength she had cultivated over her years on the bench. Suddenly, a commotion broke her thoughts. A door slammed, and a commanding voice echoed through the station. "What's going on here?" Regina turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of a man in a sharp suit. It was one of her colleagues, District Attorney Marcus Hale. He was a relentless advocate for justice and someone who had worked alongside Regina on numerous cases. His face, usually calm and collected, was now a mask of fury. "Judge Holt," he called out, spotting her in the cell. "What in the world is this?" Bradley and Kent immediately stiffened, their earlier bravado evaporating. It's just a routine." "Routine?" Hale cut him off, his voice like a whip. "You arrested a sitting judge. On what grounds?" The room fell silent. Regina remained seated, her face betraying none of the emotions churning inside her. She wanted to speak, but she knew Hale could handle this better than anyone. She was acting suspicious. Kent stammered. "Suspicious?" Hale repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "Do you even understand what you've done? Or are you too blinded by your assumptions to see it?" Bradley stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "We were just doing our job, sir." "Your job?" Hale snapped. "Your job is to uphold the law, not violate it." Regina watched as the balance of power shifted in the room. For the first time that evening, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hale's presence was a reminder that the truth still mattered, that justice could still prevail. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After what felt like an eternity, the officers reluctantly unlocked the cell. As the door swung open, Regina stood, her posture as dignified as ever. She met Hale's gaze, nodding her thanks, before turning to face the two officers. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I trust we'll be seeing each other again soon." The weight of her words hung in the air as she walked out of the station, her head held high. The humiliation of the evening still clung to her, but so did her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, mistreated, or dismissed, and she wasn't about to let it go. As she stepped into the cool night air, Hale by her side, Regina allowed herself a small smile. The officers didn't know it yet, but their actions had set something much larger in motion. But even as she left the station, Regina knew the real fight was just beginning. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet chatter as the officers entered, their confidence restored by the knowledge that they'd face only a disciplinary hearing. Officer Bradley and Officer Kent walked side by side, their postures upright, their faces smug. They exchanged quick glances, clearly unconcerned about the outcome. After all, they had their defense prepared. She was just a driver acting suspiciously, nothing more. The courtroom itself was modest, with polished wood paneling and rows of seats filling with spectators. To the officers, it was just another room in the justice system, a place where people like them always seemed to hold the upper hand. But as they approached the front of the room, something caught their attention. A murmur swept through the crowd, the kind of shift in energy that made people sit a little straighter. When the bailiff announced, "All rise," the officers were still oblivious. They stood respectfully, hands clasped in front of them, waiting for the judge to enter. Then the doors to the chambers opened, and Judge Regina Holt stepped inside, her black robe billowing slightly as she ascended the bench. Bradley and Kent froze. Their faces, once smug, turned ashen. Kent blinked as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman they'd handcuffed days earlier with the authority figure now sitting before them. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his partner. Neither spoke. Regina took her seat, her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate. She surveyed the room briefly before speaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "This court is now in session. We are here to address allegations of misconduct by Officers Bradley and Kent. Let us proceed." The tension in the room was palpable. Regina's composure was unshakable, but beneath it was a storm of emotions. She had waited for this moment not out of vengeance, but because she understood the weight of accountability. Today wasn't about personal vindication. It was about something much larger. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Cynthia Blake, presented the case against the officers. She detailed their actions, from the unjustified stop to the baseless arrest, using evidence from body cam footage and witness statements. The footage played on a screen, showing the officers' dismissive tones and unnecessary escalation. Gasps rippled through the room as the video captured the moment Regina calmly identified herself as a judge, only to be ignored. Bradley squirmed in his seat, his earlier confidence shattered. Kent avoided eye contact with anyone, his hands gripping the edges of the table. When it was Regina's turn to address the room, she removed her glasses and leaned slightly forward, her voice steady and measured. "Officers Bradley and Kent," she began, "this is not about me. This is about the trust that society places in its law enforcement, a trust that you, through your actions, have violated." Her words were precise, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. She spoke not as a victim, but as a judge, laying out the broader implications of their behavior. "Your actions on that night were not just an affront to me as an individual. They were an affront to every person who expects fairness and respect from those sworn to protect and serve." The officers shifted uncomfortably as Regina continued. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. Instead, she exuded a quiet strength that made every word hit harder. The room hung on her every sentence, the weight of her presence impossible to ignore. The officer's defense attorney attempted to argue that Bradley and Kent had acted out of caution, citing vague concerns about potential threats. But Regina wasn't swayed. "Caution," she said, "does not excuse prejudice. Fear does not excuse misconduct. And assumptions based on appearances have no place in the fair administration of the law." By the end of the hearing, the officers' arrogance had dissolved entirely. They sat with shoulders slumped, faces pale, as Regina prepared to deliver her ruling. She didn't berate them or humiliate them. Instead, she issued a thoughtful yet firm decision, one that held them accountable while emphasizing the need for systemic change. "In my courtroom," she said in closing, "justice is not a privilege reserved for a few. It is a right, and it is my duty to uphold it without bias, without exception." Her words were met with a wave of quiet murmurs and nods from the audience. Even those who might have doubted her before could see that this wasn't just about a personal grievance.